There's a moment most men miss, not when she pulls away, but when you don't react the way she expected. You didn't beg, explain, or chase. You stayed calm, and that quiet restraint is what unsettled her the most. In this video, we'll break down why your silence had more impact than any words ever could, and how it reflects the steady inner control practiced by Stoic men for centuries. If this resonates, like the video, subscribe to the channel, and let's begin. Number 1. The unexpected silence. She thought the story would continue the same way it always had. A little tension, a little distance, and then you stepping in to smooth things over. An explanation. A message sent too soon. Some emotional effort to restore balance. That pattern felt familiar to her. Predictable. Safe. It confirmed the role she believed you played in her life. But instead, everything stopped. No fixing. No clarifying. No chasing. Just silence. And that silence didn't feel empty. It felt wrong. Disruptive. Like a door closing without a sound. Leaving her alone in a room she wasn't prepared to sit in. What made it unsettling wasn't the absence of words. It was the absence of reaction. Silence usually carries expectation. Someone is thinking, preparing, waiting. But your silence didn't carry urgency or anxiety. It carried composure. In Stoic philosophy, the most powerful action is often restraint. Not because nothing is felt, but because what is felt no longer controls behavior. Your silence wasn't punishment. It wasn't withdrawal out of fear. It was self-command. And when someone expects emotional movement and instead meets stillness, their internal balance starts to wobble. From her perspective, this wasn't how it was supposed to go. Silence was meant to pull you closer, not push you inward. She may have checked her phone more than once, half expecting something to arrive late, a follow-up, a moment of weakness. But as time passed, the realization settled in. You weren't reacting. You weren't negotiating. You weren't trying to manage her perception of you. And that's when the shift happened. Because when a man doesn't rush to be understood, it forces the other person to sit with their own assumptions. This is where Stoicism quietly enters the moment. A Stoic man doesn't rush to fill silence because he doesn't fear it. He understands that not every feeling requires expression, and not every situation requires intervention. By withholding reaction, you didn't escalate emotion. You removed it from the equation entirely. And without emotional noise, the mind starts asking different questions. Not, how do I respond to him? But, why isn't he responding at all? That question lingers longer than any argument ever could. Because arguments give structure. Silence gives space. And in that space, she begins to feel something unfamiliar, not rejection, but loss of control over the narrative. You didn't disappear dramatically. You didn't make a statement. You simply stopped participating in a pattern that no longer aligned with your inner order. And that quiet decision is what haunted her. Not because you vanished, but because you stayed calm when she expected you to react. Number 2. The missing validation. For a long time, your attention served as a mirror. It reflected her importance back to her in subtle but powerful ways. Even when things weren't smooth, even during tension or disagreement, your emotional engagement reassured her that she still mattered. You showed up. You reacted. You cared enough to explain yourself. And in her mind, that effort wasn't just about connection, it was confirmation. As long as you were emotionally present, her place in your world felt secure. Then you stopped chasing, and something essential vanished with it. What disappeared wasn't affection, it was validation. The quiet reassurance that came from knowing she could still draw emotion from you. When you didn't reach out to clarify, to soothe, or to re-establish emotional contact, the signal she relied on went dark. There was no argument to respond to, no explanation to analyze. no emotional energy to interpret as proof of relevance. And without that feedback loop, uncertainty crept in. This is where the shift becomes deeply internal for her. Validation is rarely acknowledged while it's present, but its absence is impossible to ignore. When you withdrew your emotional investment, she didn't just feel distance, she felt unconfirmed, and that's unsettling, because it forces a question she never had to ask before. If he isn't trying to be seen by me, am I still seen by him? Stoic philosophy speaks quietly but clearly here. There is a difference between connection and dependence. When a man anchors his sense of worth internally, he no longer seeks approval to steady himself. By turning inward instead of outward, you chose composure over reassurance. You chose self-respect over emotional bargaining. And without saying a word, you signaled that your peace no longer required validation from her. From the outside, this might look like indifference, but emotionally, it lands very differently. Indifference is cold and dismissive. What you embodied was something else entirely, self-contained, calm. And that kind of calm doesn't invite reaction. It invites reflection. She starts replaying moments, wondering when the shift happened. Not because she wants you back immediately, but because she wants to understand why her presence no longer pulls at you the way it once did. The door didn't slam. There was no confrontation, no dramatic goodbye. It simply closed quietly, firmly, without asking permission, and that's what makes it linger in her mind. When validation disappears without explanation, the mind keeps searching for it. Your silence didn't announce distance. It revealed independence. And that realization, that your sense of self no longer depends on being acknowledged, is what unsettles her most. And this is a good moment to pause and reflect on what's really happening beneath the surface. What you're seeing isn't about punishment, revenge, or trying to provoke a reaction. It's about the quiet power of emotional self-containment. When validation is no longer offered freely, it creates space, and in that space, awareness grows. Before we move into the next shift, take a second to notice how this lands for you. If this perspective resonates, support the video by liking it. And I'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment sharing what stood out to you, or simply type "I choose peace over reaction" below. Your reflection is part of the process. Number 3. Her certainty starts to slip. When she first pulled back, she felt certain. Certainty is comforting. It gives the mind something to stand on. She believed she understood how this would unfold, the emotional rhythm, the sequence of reactions. Distance would create tension. Tension would draw you forward. You would reach out, try to repair, try to explain, try to restore what felt unsettled. That expectation gave her confidence, not because she wanted to hurt you, but because predictability creates a sense of control. As long as your behavior followed a familiar pattern, her decision felt solid. But then you didn't do what you were supposed to do. You didn't react emotionally. You didn't push for clarity. You didn't show up trying to fix what was left unsaid. And in that moment, her certainty didn't shatter dramatically, it thinned, quietly, almost invisibly. The story she relied on no longer had the emotional evidence to support it. And when certainty loses its footing, the mind begins to wobble. That's when the questions start. Not the dramatic ones, but the unsettling ones. Did I misread him? Did he care less than I thought? Or did he care in a way I didn't understand? These questions don't arrive all at once. They surface in pauses, in moments of comparison, in the silence between distractions. Because certainty doesn't require truth, it only requires confirmation. And your calm stopped confirming her assumptions. Epictetus observed that humans fear the unknown more than the painful. Pain is familiar, it has shape. The unknown does not. Your silence didn't communicate rejection or indifference, it communicated neutrality. And neutrality is difficult to interpret. There was no emotional signal to react to, no energy to measure against her own. Without that reference point, her confidence in the situation began to erode. What makes this especially powerful is that you didn't do anything to create uncertainty. You simply refused to rush toward emotional closure. A Stoic man understands that not every moment requires explanation. Sometimes clarity emerges only when emotion steps aside. By staying composed, you removed yourself from the emotional push and pull that usually stabilizes assumptions. And without that dynamic, her mind had to sit with unanswered questions. Uncertainty is uncomfortable because it demands attention. It doesn't allow the mind to settle. It keeps returning, replaying, reconsidering. And the more time passes without reaction from you, the more that uncertainty deepens. Not into longing, but into doubt about her own certainty. This is where the shift truly takes hold. She no longer feels confidently distant. She feels cautiously observant, watching, wondering, trying to understand what changed not in you, but in the emotional gravity of the situation. Your calm became the unknown. And once certainty gives way to uncertainty, the dynamic is no longer under her control. Number 4. Curiosity quietly returns. She doesn't announce it. She doesn't even fully admit it to herself. But at some point, curiosity slips back in. Not loudly, not emotionally, quietly, almost cautiously. She starts paying attention again, not to what you say, but to what you don't. The silence is still there, unchanged. And what unsettles her now isn't the absence of contact, but the steadiness of it. Silence driven by emotion fades quickly. Silence driven by composure does not. And that difference doesn't go unnoticed. At first, she may tell herself she's simply checking out of habit. A glance here, a moment of awareness there. Nothing intentional, nothing meaningful. But beneath that surface explanation is a deeper question forming. Why hasn't he moved? Not forward, not backward, just steady. In the past, distance would eventually trigger a reaction. Some shift in tone, some signal of frustration or longing. But this time, nothing changes. And that consistency begins to pull her attention in. Stoic men don't respond to emotional gravity the way others do. They don't move because they're pulled, and they don't retreat because they're pushed. They observe, they measure, they act with purpose, not impulse. Your lack of pursuit wasn't an emotional tactic, it was alignment. You weren't withholding affection to provoke a response. You were simply no longer operating from urgency, and that calm self-containment creates a different kind of presence. Curiosity thrives in the absence of explanation. If you had reached out, clarified your intentions, or expressed your emotions, the mystery would dissolve. She would have something to categorize, something to label. But your silence offers no easy interpretation. It doesn't communicate anger. It doesn't communicate desire. It doesn't even communicate closure. It communicates stability. And stability, when unexpected, becomes magnetic. This is where the dynamic subtly reverses. She isn't trying to reconnect. She isn't missing you in the way people usually mean. She's trying to understand you, and understanding requires attention. Her mind begins circling the same quiet question. What does he know that I don't? Because calm like yours doesn't come from indifference. It comes from inner order. From someone who has made peace with uncertainty rather than fighting it. Without realizing it, she starts comparing. Other interactions feel reactive. Emotional energy feels inconsistent. Conversations feel charged with expectation. And against that backdrop, your steadiness stands out. Not loudly, not dramatically, but clearly. Like gravity, unseen, but undeniable. You didn't chase her attention. You didn't ask to be noticed. And that's precisely why curiosity returns. Because when a man remains composed without needing validation, the silence stops feeling empty. It starts feeling intentional. And once silence feels intentional, it invites questions the mind can't easily dismiss. Number 5. The mirror disappears. For a long time, your reactions served a quiet but powerful function. They reflected something back to her, not just how you felt, but how she mattered. Every response, every emotional adjustment, every moment you engaged gave her feedback. It told her where she stood. It confirmed her influence. Even silence in the past had meaning, because it eventually led to response. But when you stopped responding altogether, something unfamiliar happened. The mirror disappeared. No reaction means no reflection. And without reflection, there's no easy way to measure impact. At first, this absence feels confusing rather than painful. She may tell herself you're busy, distracted, or simply taking space. But over time, the lack of emotional feedback becomes harder to ignore. There's no reassurance to lean on, no subtle signal to interpret, no emotional echo returning to her. And that's when the discomfort begins, not because she misses you, but because she can no longer see herself through your attention. Seneca wrote that true value doesn't announce itself, it is recognized. When your attention was present, it quietly recognized her role in your world, not with praise or dependency, but with engagement. And when that recognition vanished without explanation, it forced her into unfamiliar territory. She could no longer assess her significance based on your reactions. She had to sit with unanswered questions instead. This moment is deeply unsettling because most people are not accustomed to evaluating their impact internally. They rely on response, on feedback, on emotional confirmation. When you removed yourself calmly, without anger, without explanation, you didn't just step back from the connection. You removed a reference point she had grown comfortable using. And suddenly, she's left alone with her own assumptions. Did she matter as much as she thought? Was her presence essential or simply accommodated? These questions don't come from insecurity alone. They come from the loss of contrast. When someone no longer reacts, the mind searches inward for answers it used to find externally. And that inward turn is uncomfortable. From a Stoic perspective, this is the natural result of self-contained worth. You didn't need to prove your value through reaction, and you didn't need to reinforce hers through attention. You chose inner alignment over emotional exchange. And by doing so, you revealed something without ever stating it. Your presence was never conditional on validation. That realization lands slowly, but it lingers. Because once the mirror is gone, it can't be used again in the same way. She begins to understand, perhaps for the first time, that your attention was not automatic. It was intentional. And the quiet withdrawal of something intentional carries far more weight than its dramatic removal ever could. Take a moment before we move forward. What just shifted wasn't loud or dramatic. It was internal. When reactions disappear, awareness has to come from somewhere else. That pause creates reflection, and reflection is where meaning starts to change. Let this land for a second. If any part of this resonates with your experience, leave a comment and share what stood out to you, or simply reflect quietly. The next part builds on this shift, and it deepens in a way most people don't expect. Number 6. The shift in emotional power. There's a moment quiet, unspoken, when the emotional balance changes. It doesn't happen with confrontation. It doesn't come from a bold statement or a dramatic exit. It happens when you stop explaining yourself. When you no longer try to clarify your intentions, justify your actions, or guide her toward understanding. In that absence, something subtle but decisive takes place. The emotional effort changes direction. Before, the energy flowed from you outward. You were the one trying to stabilize the situation, make sense of the distance, restore clarity. That effort gave her the upper hand without either of you naming it. Because the one who explains is often the one seeking alignment. But when you stopped doing that, when you allowed silence to stand without commentary, the dynamic flipped. Now, she's the one thinking. She replays moments, not because she wants answers from you, but because there are none coming. She analyzes tone, timing, memory. She wonders what you felt, what you decided when the shift happened. And that wondering occupies space. Emotional power doesn't belong to the loudest voice. It belongs to the one who doesn't need to speak to remain steady. Stoic thinkers understood this well. Emotional strength is not the ability to persuade others. It's the ability to govern oneself. When a man no longer seeks reassurance, he no longer hands control of his emotional state to someone else. By staying composed, you didn't pressure her to respond. You removed yourself from the cycle entirely. And cycles only exist as long as both sides participate. What makes this powerful is that it isn't manipulative. You didn't withdraw to provoke a reaction. You withdrew because you reached clarity. There's a difference. Manipulation is driven by outcome. Discipline is driven by alignment. And alignment creates a presence that doesn't chase, explain, or defend itself. It simply is. From her perspective, this shift is unsettling. She's no longer reacting to your emotions. You're no longer offering them. Instead, she's reacting to the absence of them. And absence creates space. Space creates reflection. Reflection creates emotional movement. But now, it's happening on her side of the equation. You didn't claim power. You didn't assert dominance. You didn't draw lines in the sand. You simply governed yourself. And self-governance changes the emotional terrain. When one person stops needing resolution, the other begins seeking it. Not because they were forced to, but because imbalance demands awareness. Your steadiness became leverage without ever trying to be. Not because silence is a trick, but because discipline carries weight. And when emotional energy is no longer being managed or explained, it naturally reorients itself toward the source of calm. Number 7. Your calm becomes a standard. At some point, something subtle begins to happen, and she may not even realize it at first. Comparison quietly enters the picture, not in a deliberate, analytical way, but instinctively. As new interactions fill the space you once occupied, your calm starts to stand out in hindsight. The way you handled tension, the way you didn't escalate emotion, the way you chose dignity over drama. What once felt understated now feels rare. When you were present, your steadiness may have gone unnoticed because it was consistent. Calm doesn't announce itself. It doesn't demand attention. It simply holds its shape. But once it's gone, contrast forms. Other conversations feel reactive. Other dynamics feel unstable. Emotional exchanges feel louder, messier, heavier. And without trying to, your past behavior becomes a quiet benchmark against which everything else is measured. This is how standards are formed, not through persuasion, but through experience. She may find herself thinking about how easy it was to talk to you without things spiraling, how disagreements didn't turn into emotional chaos, how you listened without needing to win, how you walked away without bitterness or theatrics. These reflections aren't romanticized fantasies, they're points of comparison. And comparison has weight, because once the mind recognizes order, disorder becomes harder to tolerate. Stoic warriors were trained to remain composed under pressure, not to impress others, but to preserve clarity within themselves. Their calm wasn't passive, it was disciplined. And discipline leaves an impression long after the moment has passed. You didn't perform strength, you embodied restraint. And restraint, once remembered, becomes a standard others are unconsciously judged against. What makes this powerful is that you didn't try to be memorable. You didn't seek to leave an impression. You simply acted in alignment with your values. You didn't linger to explain your decision. You didn't stay to soften the impact. You trusted your composure to speak for itself. And now, that composure echoes quietly in her mind, not as nostalgia, but as contrast. This is where regret doesn't come from loss. It comes from realization. The realization that calm like yours isn't common. That emotional steadiness isn't guaranteed. And that dignity, once encountered, changes expectations permanently. She may not miss you in the way people expect, but she notices the absence of what you represented. Your calm didn't demand recognition in the moment. It earned it over time. And once calm becomes a reference point, it can't be unseen. Everything else is measured against it quietly, involuntarily, and without your involvement at all. Number 8. Her ego feels the weight. What she feels here isn't heartbreak. It's something more subtle and more uncomfortable. It's identity friction. The kind that happens when reality no longer confirms the version of ourselves we quietly relied on. She didn't expect collapse. She expected continuity. Even distance was supposed to keep you emotionally available. A message, an explanation, a signal that her presence still shaped your inner world. When that didn't happen, the emotional ground beneath her shifted. Ego isn't arrogance, it's orientation. It tells us where we stand in relation to others. And for a long time, your responses reinforced that orientation for her. Your willingness to engage, to clarify, to emotionally reach across uncertainty affirmed her influence. Not consciously, not maliciously, but reliably. When you stopped doing that, the ego didn't feel rejected. It felt dislodged. This is where discomfort sets in, because the ego doesn't like unanswered questions about relevance. If you had argued, she could frame herself as justified. If you had pleaded, she could feel desired. If you had explained, she could interpret your emotions and place herself at the center of the story. But your calm offered none of that. There was no emotional leverage to grip, no role left to play. Zeno taught that true strength isn't loud, it's revealed through posture, not physical posture, but emotional bearing. How a man holds himself when nothing is being asked of him. You didn't announce boundaries. You didn't assert independence. You simply stood still in your own emotional space. And that posture communicated something unmistakable. Your inner world wasn't up for negotiation. That realization doesn't wound, it presses. It applies weight, because it forces a reckoning not about love, but about control. She may never articulate it this way, but the feeling is clear. I don't move him anymore. And for the ego, that's a heavy truth to carry. Not because she wanted power over you, but because she assumed it without question. This is why the impact lingers. There's no moment to point to, no argument to revisit, no final exchange to reinterpret, just the quiet awareness that you didn't bend. And bending, even slightly, would have preserved familiarity. Instead, your composure introduced a new reality, one where emotional influence is earned, not assumed. You didn't take anything from her. You simply stopped offering access to something she thought was permanent. And when ego meets that kind of boundary unspoken, calm, and immovable, it doesn't react loudly. It absorbs the weight in silence. That truth hits harder than any goodbye ever could. And this is where it's worth pausing before we go any further. Because what just shifted isn't only about her reaction. It's about the quiet power of what happens when you stop explaining yourself to be understood. Take a moment to reflect on this. Notice how different this feels from anger, from confrontation, from closure. This is influence dissolving without conflict. If any part of this resonates with your own experience, share your thoughts in the comments, or simply type, "I chose calm over control," to mark that recognition for yourself. When you're ready, we'll move into what this internal pressure begins to transform into next. Number 9. Doubt replace confidence. There was a time when she felt sure, not emotionally certain in a dramatic sense, but settled. She believed she understood her position in your life, the weight she carried, the role she played. That confidence didn't come from constant reassurance. It came from familiarity, from patterns that repeated often enough to feel permanent. As long as you responded, explained, or adjusted yourself emotionally, her place felt defined, secure, known. But silence has a way of loosening assumptions. When you didn't react, didn't clarify, didn't attempt to re-establish emotional contact, something subtle shifted inside her. The confidence she once leaned on began to thin, not because you rejected her, but because you stopped confirming what she believed. And without confirmation, certainty loses its footing. What replaces it isn't panic, it's doubt. Quiet, persistent doubt. This doubt isn't about whether she lost you. It's about whether she ever understood you at all. Did I misjudge his depth? His self-respect? His independence? These questions surface not as regret, but as recalibration. Because your calm doesn't fit the version of you she had in mind. The version who would reach. The version who would need closure. The version who would struggle visibly with distance. Stoicism teaches that when something shakes easily, it was never stable. Her confidence shakes now because it wasn't grounded in reality, it was grounded in assumption. She assumed your emotional availability was fixed. She assumed your engagement meant dependence. She assumed your presence was guaranteed. And those assumptions worked only as long as they went unchallenged. Your silence challenged them without argument. This is what makes the doubt so uncomfortable. There's no clear mistake to correct, no apology to offer, no obvious path back to certainty. The old emotional rules no longer apply, and the new ones haven't revealed themselves. So, the mind circles, replays, questions. Doubt isn't loud, but it's persistent. It revisits moments she once dismissed. It reframes memories that once felt settled, and each time it does, her confidence loses a little more ground. What's important to understand is that this doubt isn't about longing, it's about value. When someone realizes they may have underestimated something, the realization lingers, because underestimation implies loss not of connection, but of awareness. She isn't asking whether you care. She's wondering whether she failed to see what mattered while it was present. And you didn't need to say any of this. You didn't need to assert worth or prove strength. You simply stood still while assumptions collapsed under their own weight. In Stoic terms, truth doesn't argue. It reveals itself when illusion can no longer hold. And once confidence gives way to doubt, the dynamic is no longer comfortable. It's unsettled, reflective, and quietly irreversible. Number 10. A new story forms in her mind. For a long time, the story she held about you felt settled. It explained everything neatly. Who wanted more? Who would feel the distance first? Who would eventually return to restore balance? That narrative gave her emotional clarity, even if it wasn't entirely accurate. Stories do that. They organize uncertainty into something manageable, and as long as you played your expected role, the story held together. But when you didn't chase, the structure collapsed. Without pursuit, the old explanation stopped working. The familiar labels attached, emotionally invested, afraid to lose her, no longer fit the evidence in front of her. There was no reaction to reinforce them, no behavior to reinterpret. And when a story no longer explains reality, the mind is forced to revise it. That's when the new thoughts begin to surface. Not all at once, not confidently, but persistently. Maybe he didn't need me the way I thought. Maybe he wasn't afraid to lose me. Maybe his silence isn't weakness, it's choice. These ideas feel unsettling because they challenge the emotional hierarchy she once assumed. The power dynamic she believed in quietly rearranges itself. This is where Stoic distance becomes important. A Stoic doesn't rush to interpret events from inside the chaos. He steps back. He observes. He lets patterns reveal themselves without emotional distortion. Your silence did exactly that for her. By removing yourself from the emotional battlefield, you gave her space to see the situation from a wider angle. And from that vantage point, the image of you changes. What once felt passive now looks intentional. What once seemed available now appears selective. What once felt predictable now feels grounded. She begins to realize that your composure wasn't a lack of feeling, it was self-respect in action, and self-respect doesn't announce itself. It shows up through consistency, restraint, and the refusal to beg for emotional resolution. This new story isn't comforting for her at first. It doesn't center her the way the old one did. It doesn't frame you as someone waiting, hoping, or holding on. Instead, it introduces a version of you that operates independently of her response. A man who chooses peace over persuasion. A man who doesn't need to be chosen to remain whole. And once that story takes shape, it can't be unseen. Because it's supported not by words, but by behavior. You didn't argue for a different narrative. You didn't defend yourself against misinterpretation. You let time and silence do the work. And over time, the picture becomes clearer. From this new vantage point, you look very different than she expected. Not distant, not cold, but solid, self-contained, and grounded in something that doesn't shift with circumstance. That realization doesn't spark drama, it sparks respect. And respect, once earned quietly, rewrites everything that came before. And this is the moment where the shift becomes real. Not just for her, but for the story she used to tell herself. Take a breath here. Think about how your silence did something. Explanation never could. It invited reflection. It created contrast. It made her see you differently, not because you asked her to, but because your actions gave her no choice. If this resonates, share your thoughts in the comments, or simply type, "My silence revealed the truth." Let's move on and find out what happens next. Number 11. Reaching out feels risky. And this is the final shift, the one that quietly changes everything. If she considers reaching out now, it no longer feels light. It doesn't feel casual or safe or familiar. It feels exposed. The message she once could have sent without thinking now carries weight. Meaning, consequence. Because the emotional ground beneath her is no longer stable, and she knows it. Earlier, reaching out would have felt almost automatic. A check-in, a signal, a way to reassert connection without risk. She could rely on your emotional availability to cushion the moment. Even silence back then felt temporary, something that would eventually bend. But now, after your steady withdrawal, that safety net is gone. There's no guarantee of response, no assurance of warmth, no predictable outcome waiting on the other side of the message. And that changes how the hand feels hovering over the screen. What makes this moment difficult isn't fear of rejection alone, it's fear of exposure. Reaching out now would mean acknowledging uncertainty. It would mean admitting she doesn't fully understand where she stands. It would mean stepping into emotional risk without knowing whether the door is open or quietly closed. And that kind of risk demands courage. Zeno believed that meaningful actions should feel weighty, that when something matters, it shouldn't be done lightly or impulsively. Your calm made this moment meaningful. By not chasing, not explaining, not trying to manage the outcome, you restored gravity to action. Contact is no longer casual, because connection is no longer assumed. This is the irony most men never see. Chasing lowers the cost of reaching out. It makes contact easy, comfortable, low stakes. Silence does the opposite. Silence doesn't punish, it clarifies. It removes emotional padding. And without padding, every step forward must be intentional. She may open the conversation window more than once. Type something. Delete it. Reconsider the tone. Wonder what it implies. Because now, any message she sends says something about her, not you. It reveals vulnerability, curiosity, courage, and ego doesn't like acting without protection. This is why courage only appears when comfort is gone. You didn't demand bravery from her. You didn't corner her into a decision. You simply removed yourself from the emotional safety she relied on. And in doing so, you gave weight back to choice. If she reaches out now, it won't be because she feels in control. It will be because she's willing to risk not being. And that's the final truth of your silence. It didn't end the story, it matured it. It transformed contact from habit into intention, from certainty into courage. And whether she ever reaches out or not, the shift has already happened. You didn't chase, you didn't explain, you didn't beg. And because of that, every move forward now carries meaning. When you didn't beg, explain, or chase, you didn't push her away, you revealed something. You showed that your peace doesn't depend on her. You showed that your value is not negotiable. You showed that your silence carries more truth than words ever could. And that's what lingers in her mind long after the moment has passed. If this breakdown helped you see the situation with more clarity, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and keep protecting your peace with strength, discipline, and calm.